So first, welcome. It's fantastic that all of you could be here for new President Salave's celebration, and also that I could get to take part in that celebration by sharing with you guys some of the work that we've been up to trying to get at the roots of human irrationality by turning to our closest living relatives. Are you guys getting the feedback a little bit there? Or is that just me? Okay. So what I wanted to do today was to tell you a little bit about some of the work we've been up to, and just to give you a fast roadmap, I'll first try to answer the question why it makes sense to study monkeys if what you're interested in is understanding the way that humans make decisions. If you really want to know about humans, why don't you just study humans? Well, I'll try to convince you that turning to our closest evolutionary relatives is a fantastic way to get insight into what's going on in each and every one of your heads out there, even though you're from the human species, not one of these guys up there. After that, we'll talk a little bit about why it makes sense to study decision-making in monkeys, and I'll tell you about a couple cases where we've been trying to see whether the monkeys that we look at are just as irrational as human beings. And we're going to do that in the context of studying whether monkeys show framing effects like humans do, and also whether they show some price biases in the same way that we do. And hopefully, if we have time at the end, we'll get into this question of what we can learn from all this work in monkeys and how we can become better decision makers by understanding what primates do. Okay, but first the question of why it makes sense to study monkeys. Well, there's a bunch of different ways to introduce this, but I thought I'd do one that gives a nice nod to my favorite webcomic out there, which is called XKCD, a wonderful thing to add to your web browsing if you don't know it. But here's the XKCD version of this insight. And it's not anything specific to this webcomic, it's exactly the kind of thing that happens when people meet each other for the first time, and they're trying to figure out how to make sense of what's going on inside somebody's head. What is this person really like? So imagine you're doing this, you're meeting somebody for the first time, you'll probably do this at some point during this celebration, shake somebody's hand that you meet, and the question is, what do you ask them to get to know them? And this is the part where we really quiz you like a real audience. Like, what do you ask? What are the things you ask? You can yell it out. What's your job? Where are you from? I heard one of those, and that's the real answer, right? So I can give this talk to a group of Yale staff members, Yale faculty, alums. I can give this in high schools. Everybody pretty soon comes up with that answer. Why do we ask this? Why does it matter? Well, it matters where you're from because that tells me something about what you're like right now. If I found out that you grew up in New Haven versus in Boston versus in Shanghai or Paris versus the very same street that I grew up on, it's going to tell me something about what you're like as an adult. Where you came from tells me something about what you're like as an adult. And this is the very same insight we have when we want to understand what I think is the biggest puzzle out there, and that's what's going on inside our heads. What controls our behaviors, our motivations, our decisions? These are big fundamental problems, but if we want to understand them, we're going to have to give these big questions the very same insight we give when we think about getting to know somebody, which is, where do all these fantastic, interesting processes come from in the first place? What's the origin of the way our mind works? And the good news is that this isn't something that we just get to speculate about. This is something we can empirically ask by doing different kinds of studies. One of the different populations that gives us insight into this is to actually study what's going on inside the minds of very, very young human babies. So you can really get to know what's going on inside the adult mind by studying the minds of these folks up here. And this is exactly the kind of research that folks in the psychology department here at Yale do. My colleagues Karen Wynn and Paul Bloom and Frank Kyle and others do exactly this, where they'll take into the lab this little guy right here on this side of the couch, try to study how does he make sense of the world, what are his decision processes look like, what does his cognition look like, and then we can see how that cognition changes over time as we kind of pass over the developmental couch. And this can give us some really rich insight into what's going on in the mind. It can tell us, how does the mind get shaped by things like human teaching? How does the mind get shaped by things like human language and human pedagogy and human culture and schooling? This is the kind of insight we get into taking a developmental approach. Our lab does something similar, except our goal is to look not at the developmental origins, but at the evolutionary origins. So in an ideal world, we'd do something like this. We'd have our own couch, except on it wouldn't be children of different ages. It would be ancestors that we had over evolutionary history. So we'd kind of bring this guy into the lab. He's like Australopithecine. We'd study how he made sense of the world and what he knew about the world. And we could see how that changed over evolutionary time as we get access to things like human language and human culture and human teaching. This would be a fantastic empirical approach, except it's turned out to be really hard to recruit subjects, because the very subjects you want are in fact dead. And I can say this with certainty. I was a graduate student at Harvard. I was over there. None of these guys are still around, even at those other schools, right? So we have to take a bit of a different approach. We have to use a proxy. We can't study our direct ancestors. And what we try to do in our own lab is to turn to the best proxy we have, which is to ask these very same questions about our closest living evolutionary relatives, the non-human primates. And so I know some of you are probably not as familiar with your close primate tree, and so I'm going to give you a very Yale-centric version of the primate order. Here is your evolutionary family right here. This is a slide that you can show only once, or else it starts looking weird when you start showing this here. But this is the kind of family we're talking about, and it provides a window much like that developmental couch. We can compare and contrast cognition at the top of this evolutionary tree. And that can give us insight into how cognition changed across evolutionary time. And we do this by studying a couple of different branches at the top of the tree. We've tried to focus mostly on the furthest branches that we have out there. First, these guys here, the prosimian primates, the lemurs. These are our most distantly related primate cousins, and we've been able to study them out at a field reserve down in Mayaca City, Florida, known as the Lemur Conservation Foundation. The lemurs free range around a big 30-acre enclosure, and we can set up little enrichment games and cognition games for the lemurs to play that are fun for the lemurs, but they give us insight into how the lemurs are thinking about the world. So here's a former undergraduate, Jen Barnes, trying to get at what lemurs know about counting. And so that's the lemurs we work with. We also work with a more closely related primate species, these guys here. This is the New World monkey, the brown capuchin monkey. We're lucky enough to work with a group of these guys here at a facility at Yale. The monkeys live in a big social enclosure with their families. They have lots of fun, and it's great for us because we can get up close and personal with them and do the kinds of studies I'm going to tell you about in just a bit. And so these are the capuchin monkeys that we work with, but we're also lucky enough to work with a group of monkeys that's even more closely related to the human species. These are the Old World monkeys who branched off from the very same primate branch that we did as Old World primates ourselves. And the monkeys that we study are not in the lab. They also live down at a field site. These are rhesus macaques who live down at the island of Cayo Santiago, Puerto Rico. It's an island that's just off the coast of Puerto Rico, and it's fun to go to because it's tropical, it's filled with palm trees. You'd be surprised how easy it is to recruit undergraduates to come down and do field research with us. But it's fantastic for us because it's home to about 1,000 free-ranging primates who kind of hang out and do their monkey thing. But we can send students and staff members down there to again design studies there with the monkeys out in the wild to try to see what they know about the world. Here's a former undergraduate, Brian Edwards, doing a study to see what rhesus monkeys know about causality. And so this is the big picture, is that we can look across the different tops of these trees to try to compare and contrast how cognition looks like, what it looks like in the animal mind, and try to see how that compares with humans. And we get insight into things that are unique to our species, like the role of language, the role of human culture, and so on. Typically, when you're taking this kind of approach, it tends to look like trying to study thinking in non-human animals to get some insight into whether the way non-human animals think is some of the same ways that we do. And in particular, we tend to focus on the kinds of abilities that we're most proud of in the human species, the things that make us really smart. That's what we want to know the origins of. Where do these smart things really come from? And there's been lots and lots of work exploring just these kind of abilities in non-human primates. For example, there's lots of work taking place down at the field sites trying to get a sense of whether or not non-human primates understand something about number. Can they count small numbers of objects in the same way that we do? The answer seems to be that they can, but only up to a limited number of objects. So there's interesting similarities and interesting differences there. There's also some research interest in trying to see whether or not non-human animals understand the physical world in the same way we do. Obviously, we as humans are using all kinds of artifacts and tools. Do other animals understand the same things that we do? Well, again, we can set up these physical problems for them, little tool use problems, and try to see what they understand. And the answer is that even species that don't use tools themselves seem to understand something about simple physics, simple cause and effect. And so we can look across all these different domains to ask this question, do other animals think like we do? With the kind of basic assumption that there's something special about what it means to be us, and there's something that makes us much smarter than other animals. This is what historically the work in other primates has looked at, but these days we've been sort of turning this view of non-human primates on its head. Rather than just study whether or not other animals have all the smart aspects of cognition that humans do, These days we've been asking whether or not they have some of the dumber aspects as well. Not sort of man the thinker, but kind of man the face palmer. And this is the kind of thing that you learn about human behavior if you actually hang out with humans for a lot of time. Yes, it's true that we have language and human artifact culture and so on, but our species also does a variety of very dumb things, and dumb in a particular way, not just dumb as in we do kind of crazy things all the time, but done in a systematically irrational way. We do predictable things and have predictable strategies that give us less utility, less money, and less happiness over time. But yet we do it predictably and even in the face of some bad consequences. And this raises the question of, how is it that we're doing that? Perhaps we see some seeds of these same kinds of irrational behaviors in other primates as well. And this was the sort of insight that led us to start trying to study whether other animals are as irrational as humans are. And in particular, when we started this approach, it was right around the time of the financial collapse. You couldn't click on the news programs without seeing something about how dumb people were with money and all the bad things we were doing with our economies. And we said, well, maybe this is a spot to start. Maybe this is the spot where we can start looking at these systematic biases in other primates. And so we decided to begin studying these kinds of economic biases. All of this work is done in collaboration with a fantastic former undergraduate, Venkat Lakshminarayanan, and Keith Chen, who was a professor at the time at Yale School of Management. So we kind of got together and said, where should we start if we're going to study these economic biases in monkeys? And that led us to trying to see if we could come up with monkey versions of some of the same seminal studies that had so nicely shown different economic biases in the human species. And this is mostly the work of Danny Kahneman, Amos Tversky, and their colleagues, all of which is nicely summarized in Danny's recent book, his New York Times bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow. I'm going to give you one little hint of these kinds of studies, and you'll get a sense of watching your own irrational intuitions in action. And so here's one of the studies that Danny presented to his Princeton undergraduates. You bring undergraduates into a lab, and you give them a particular scenario involving different financial amounts. So you say, this is a great study. You come into this situation, and I'm going to award you $1,000. This seems like a great study, particularly for Princeton undergraduates, who tend to be probably a lot poorer than at least some of you are. $1,000 is a big windfall, right? But now you get to decide how to get even more money. And here are your choices. You could take a risk to get more money, in which case I'm going to flip a coin. If it comes up heads, you'll get 1,000. Tails, you'll get nothing. So that's option number one. Option number two is that you could play it safe, and you could just take an extra $500 from the experimenter with certainty. And so here's more audience participation. How many go with taking a risk? Show of hands. How many go with playing it safe? Show of hands. You guys are just like Princeton undergraduates. Most of them choose to play it safe. And this makes sense, right? Princeton undergraduates, poor, probably pretty risk averse. There's nothing irrational about this. What's irrational is what happens when you are giving subjects the same ultimate outcomes, but you present it in a slightly different situation. And so here's that different situation. Now undergraduates come in and they're told, now you're going to get $2,000. This seems like an even better deal, except you now have to decide how to lose some of the money you just got. But you have a choice about how to lose it. You could either lose it in a risky way. I'll flip a coin. If it comes up heads, now that's really bad. You're going to lose $1,000. Tails, you lose nothing. Or you could choose to lose it in a very safe way. You could just give the experimenter $500 back with certainty. And now I'm taking a different dependent measure, which is smirking, which I've found is a nice measure of people's irrationalities in action. Because if you're like Princeton undergraduates, you might be thinking, hang on, now this idea of taking a risk doesn't seem so bad. Now it seems like that might be the right move, the one that I might want to go with. And this is exactly what Kahneman and colleagues found. People's risk preferences shift across these two framings. And most of you who are smiling are probably also very fast at math. You've computed the fact that these outcomes are exactly the same across the two scenarios. It's irrational to switch your preferences. So what's going on? Well, what seems to be going on is that Kahneman and colleagues were tapping into a couple different economic biases at work. The first of these is a bias known as reference dependence, or reference point setting. And all it means is just that we tend to, as a species, pay a lot more attention than we should to the status quo, to where we are right now. Why is that a problem? Well, an economist would tell you that you should probably make decisions not in a relative way, but in an absolute way. You should think of a particular decision and ask, how is this going to increase my overall welfare or my overall utility, what's going to be in my bank account at the end of the day, and so on. But that's not how we think of decisions. We tend to think of a decision as being at a particular status quo, and how that decision will affect how we move, whether it's sort of a gain or a loss relative to where we were before. To see this sort of thing in action, imagine you leave here and were to get a parking ticket. A New Haven parking ticket these days probably run you about $20. Question is, how would you think of that? I bet you wouldn't have seen that parking ticket and immediately calculated what your net wealth was minus that parking ticket. You'd just say some sort of expletive, a parking ticket, this is totally bad. This is you thinking in terms of reference dependence. You have your status quo and the parking ticket is a negative relative to that. And the parking ticket example illustrates the second bias that we see at work, which is a phenomenon known as loss aversion. This idea that changes from the status quo in the positive direction don't seem nearly as emotionally big as changes from the status quo in the negative direction. Losses seem to loom a lot larger than gains, and we sometimes work harder to avoid losses than we do to seek out equally sized gains. It seems like there's a kink in the way we think about changes from the status quo. In the scenario you just saw, your loss aversion was probably one of the things that led you to get more risky in that second scenario. In the second scenario, you had a chance of not getting a loss at all. And that seemed so good that you took on more risk than you would otherwise have wanted. And this leads to what's known as this third bias, the reflection effect. The fact that we, in fact, do get more risk-seeking when we're in the red, when we're dealing with losses. And that can lead us to take on intuitions about how to make decisions that might not fit our preferences when we're not in the red. These kinds of things happen in these funny Kahneman scenarios, but it turns out you can see them playing out in the real world in a couple of really important contexts. One of them is a puzzle that economists refer to as the equity premium puzzle. This is the fact that if you look over time, over long horizons, stocks always tend to do better overall than bonds do. However, if you look at individual portfolios, people tend to disproportionately invest in bonds relative to their ultimate value. Why is it? Why are people putting their money in bonds when stocks will, in theory, yield more money? Well, bonds don't tend to yield losses as much as stocks do. Stocks, all your stocks are hopefully going up and up and up, but occasionally they may dip, periodically into the red. The idea is those dips in the red loom so large for us that it makes stocks seem like a bad thing, making us to disproportionately invest in this thing that's safer, but doesn't yield any of the losses. So loss aversion at work in the stock market. We also seem to see something like loss aversion and reference dependence in the housing market. One of the problems in the housing market now is that people are, in some senses, pricing their houses a bit too high, and that houses aren't selling as quickly as you might think. Well, what's going on there? Well, it seems that people might be setting a reference point for the price of their house, one that's not true in the current market, but might be true in their mind. If you think about your own houses and what they're worth, I bet you have a very, very salient reference point, which is what you bought it for. And what you find is that people are very loath to sell houses for under the price they bought them for, which sometimes leads people to be holding on to houses in markets that are losing value the quickest. Setting this reference point and being averse to selling at a loss leads people to sometimes make bad decisions. But my favorite example of these biases in action happens not in real financial markets, it happens on the golf course. If you are a golfer, you know that your best strategy of performing well on the golf course is to get absolutely the lowest score. You're just trying to get the lowest score as possible. But each golf hole has a particular reference point on it. It's the par that's listed on the course right there. Par doesn't really matter. Your goal is just to get absolutely the lowest score. But it turns out that par seems to unconsciously affect golfers when they're playing. When a golfer has the risk of going above par, which seems like a loss, they end up putting more riskily. And by the same token, when a golfer knows he'll go under par, they tend to putt too conservatively. And a group of economists at Wharton Business School tried to analyze these kinds of biases as part of the PGA Tour, and they estimated that across the whole tour, the bias was costing golfers around $1.5 million. So real stakes on the golf course. These are deeply ingrained human biases. And the question is, can we see similar things in a non-human primate? And at first you might think this is a bit of a crazy question. All of these kinds of biases we've seen have been in the context of money and financial decisions. But we said, could we find a method with which we could ask these capuchin monkeys that we work with here at Yale about their own decision-making processes using something like money? And most of you guys haven't met my capuchin monkeys. I see some of you guys who've worked with the capuchin monkeys, but those of you who haven't met them might not know that they don't actually use money. So this was a sort of tricky method. Method number one that we came up with as scientists quickly, will use their money is like, no, can't use their money, back to stage B, go to the drawing board, right? Well, what we decided to do was to see if we could teach the monkeys their own kind of currency that we could use to ask them these financial questions in an experimental context. And at first we thought this was going to be really tricky to do, but it turned out that the monkeys picked it up quite easily. We introduced the monkeys to these little metal discs. It was their own form of currency, and we taught them that they could trade these discs with human experimenters for food. And so here's what this looked like in one picture. Here's Mayday, one of our monkeys. Monkeys all live in a big social enclosure, and they kind of come out by themselves for testing, so none of the other monkeys will bother them when they're making choices. Mayday comes in, she gets a little wallet of tokens, and she can hand them over to human experimenters for food. And so here's just a little video of what this looks like. It's a bit kind of French New Wave style, but you get the point. Here's Felix trading tokens to get his apple. Here's Jill, she trades her tokens, gets some apple too. And so the monkeys picked this up remarkably quickly, very, very little training, and they were using this currency very flexibly with individual experimenters. And we said, well, let's see if they're understanding this currency in any way that looks like a real market. Why don't we give them the option of buying some food from 2 different experimenters, and we'll see if they do the kinds of rational things that humans do rationally in the market, and maybe whether they also do the same kinds of irrational things that humans do too. And so our little monkey market was born. Here's how it often worked. The monkeys, as I said, come in from their social group for testing. They get a little wallet of tokens, and they meet not 1, but 2 different traders who are different students in the lab who trade different foods with the monkeys at different prices. And we signaled the different experimenters by giving them different clothes, and they're different individuals in the lab. And so the way every testing session worked is that the monkeys come in for testing, they get their little wallet, the 2 traders kind of move to either side of the monkey's enclosure, they present the food that the monkey can buy, they sort of hold it out in a little dish. The monkeys make their choice, which means they hand over one of the 2 tokens to the experimenter, the trader gives the monkeys the food, and then this keeps going until the monkeys spend all their money. Folks always ask, do the monkeys try to save the money or wait? No, they immediately spend as money as fast as they possibly can. But just to give you a sense of what the monkeys do in the market, our first question was whether or not the monkeys treated these tokens rationally at all. Could they, for example, use the tokens to spend on experimenters who are offering better prices for the same good? And so to test that, we introduced the monkeys to 2 different traders. First, the monkeys get to meet Kirk. Kirk looks like he's offering a good deal because his dish has a grape, so that's a pretty good deal for the monkeys. The monkeys also get to meet Kirk, but if you notice, Kirk is offering a better deal because he's out now offering 2 grapes. And so the question is, who does the monkey shop at, with the red experimenter or the purple guy? And so here's a quick video of what it looks like. It's kind of a sort of monkey eye view. You can see Holly has her token ready to go, sort of impatiently waiting. There she goes, her choice is 1 grape or 2, and you can see which one she picks. She shops at experimenter purple. And in fact, this is just what we find. When we give the monkeys these choices, we see at about rates of 90% the monkeys are shopping at the guy who's giving them the best deal. It turns out the monkeys don't do this just for amount of food. They can correctly pay attention to risk. So if a person is risky, they'll go with the guy who overall gives them the best amount of food. They seem to be tracking the same kinds of things that humans tend to track pretty well in real markets. And my colleague Keith Chen is fond of saying, if you plotted the monkey's data and you didn't know the data were from a monkey, you would just assume it was from a human. We were shocked at how close the monkeys were matching real humans in real markets. And so this led us to be able to ask the question we were really interested in, which is, would the monkeys now behave irrationally in the cases where humans behave irrationally? And we were able to ask that by putting the monkeys in exactly the same scenario that you guys just faced when you were doing these different scenarios. The idea is we could introduce the monkeys to experimenters who gave different foods at different rates. Some were risky, some felt like gains, but some felt like losses to the monkeys. And so here's how we introduce the monkeys to this. Here's a case like the first scenario when the monkeys are getting more than the experimenters show. Monkeys meet Vlad and Wesley, and they realize that Vlad and Wesley do different things. They look like they're starting with 1, but 100% of the time, Vlad adds an extra grape for the monkeys to give them 2. So he's like safely getting the $500 extra. The monkeys also meet Wesley, and they realize Wesley's risky. Sometimes he only gives the 1 grape he shows, but sometimes he adds 2 grapes to give the monkeys 3. And so if you're paying attention, this is exactly the same scenario as you got. The monkeys get a choice of a safe gain from Vlad or a risky gain from Wesley. Question is, what do they do? Well, what you find is that they too tend to play it safe. They tend to shop at Vlad, even though on average they're getting the same from both of these guys. Again, that might not be irrational. Maybe the monkeys are just risk averse in the same way that humans are. What happens in the context of the scenario where the monkeys are getting less than they expect? And so here's how we introduce that. The monkeys get to meet Alex. Alex looks like he's going to give the monkeys 3 grapes, but 100% of the time he takes one away to give the monkeys 2. And so the monkeys then get to meet Venkat. He also looks like he's giving 3, but he's a risky loss. Sometimes he takes none away, and sometimes he takes 2 away to give the monkeys only 1. And again, same thing, the same ultimate payoffs as we saw before, and the same average payoffs across the 2 experimenters. Do the monkeys play it safe with Alex? They just showed us they like playing it safe before, or do they now go with Venkat? And what we found robustly is that the monkeys, in this case, now tend to shift. They now become more risk-seeking, just like humans. Folks often like to see all of the monkeys' data. Here's just data plotted across 5 of the monkeys we tested. And one of the things you see, which is neat, is that the monkeys are very variable. I'm plotting how often they choose the risky experimenters. This is some measure of how much the monkeys seek out risk. And you see they kind of vary. Folks always want to know what's going on with this monkey here. This is Felix, our alpha male. He's risk-seeking all the time. He's kind of like the stockbroker monkey, I guess. Perhaps he's like the Wall Street monkey. But even he, despite the variation, is showing this framing effect where he's getting more risky. He's seeking out risk even more when he's dealing with losses than when he's dealing with gains. And so what we've found is that not only can we train the monkeys on this token economy in a way that they shows, at least in some ways, they seem to understand these tokens in a similar way to the fiat currency we use, but when we train them on that and ask them about the same problems that Kahneman and colleagues tested humans on, they're showing the same kinds of strategies and intuitions. They seem to set reference points. They don't think in terms of the absolute amount of food they get. They see it relative to what they get from the experimenter. And they seem to, like humans, avoid losses to the point that it makes them seek out risk even more. We've now gone on to test the monkeys on a couple of other different irrational biases. We've shown that they seem to overvalue goods that they own, so they seem to like food better when they have it than the food they could potentially get. This is a phenomenon in humans that's been labeled the endowment effect and shown in a variety of cases. We also seem to show that in addition to this, they seem to value these objects more, not just because they have them at the right time, but they have them immediately, but really it seems to be about actually having the object, potentially a sort of rudimentary concept of monkey ownership. But now I'm going to switch gears a bit to tell you about something else we've been working on recently, because we've seen in a bunch of cases that the monkeys tend to show biases that suggest in some ways they're as irrational as we are. But we're also starting to see hints of cases where the monkeys look very different from us. But this is different in a way than we typically see in comparative cognition. Usually when we see monkey-human differences, it's the case that humans have some complex, some relatively smart cognitive ability that other animals lack. But this is a spot where we're seeing cases where the monkeys lack a very irrational tendency that humans have. In some sense, we're seeing monkeys being smarter than people. And so we wanted to see which domains we could see this in, and we turned to some cases that we thought the monkeys might really show the same biases as we did, as in the case of our biases towards price. We've already shown that the monkeys understand something about price, and so we wanted to see if they treated price in the same irrational ways as humans do. And this is all work done with my former lab manager and undergraduate here, Nick Buttrick, and a former thesis student, Ria Catapano, who graduated a few years ago. And what we wanted to look at was to see whether or not the monkeys got tripped up by the price of an object. Usually price is a good indicator of an object's quality, but not always. It turns out, though, that we tend to use it as an indicator of quality even when the price itself is arbitrary. So I could influence the way you subjectively taste this wine just by lying to you and telling you that it was a different price than it really was. And this is what Hilke Plassman and colleagues did with subjects. They presented subjects with different kinds of wine. Each kind of wine is labeled in a color here, and told subjects different prices for those different wines. So they said, here, sip this wine, this is a $5 wine. Here, sip this wine, this is a $45 wine, but it was exactly the same wine. And they had subjects rate on a scale how much they liked them, and what they found is that subjects tend to rate wines that are just said to be more expensive as more tasty, as though I'm influencing your subjective preference for the wine by lying to you and telling you that the price is different. The neat thing, though, is that it wasn't just true in their Likert scale ratings. Plasman and colleagues are neuroscientists who also measure in reward regions of the brain how subjects are perceiving these events as they drink the wine. They're not rating them, they're really tasting them, knowing the different prices. And what they found was that if you look at a signal in the orbital frontal cortex that's thought to signal something about subjective value or reward, what you find is that the very same wine will activate this region more if you think it's $90 than if you think it's $10. Really at the level of your reward areas, you're falling for this price information. And so the question is, given that the monkeys know something about this token economy, given that we've showed that they understand something about price in these markets, do they fall for this too? If we teach them that a particular good is more expensive, will they also end up liking that more? And so this was what we embarked upon. First, we wanted to make sure, again, that the monkeys kind of understood price in their market. And the way we teach the monkeys the price of a good is to vary how much of the good they get. So the monkeys never pay us more tokens. The nominal price is always a single token, but we can vary how much food the monkeys get. So if the monkeys pay a token and get a huge, huge piece of food, that food is really cheap. If they pay a single token and get a really, really tiny piece of food, then that food would be really expensive. It's kind of like if you go into the store, you could get a huge thing of Hershey's chocolate for a couple dollars, but the nice Lindt chocolates, you only get a teeny tiny piece of it for the same price. And so we did the same sort of chocolate study with the monkeys. We introduced them to two new experimenters. This time the monkeys were getting foods that we were considering different brands. They were different pieces of cereal that the monkeys like a lot. And they meet the two experimenters who each of the brands costs the same amount in the sense that they're each getting a single piece of cereal from the experimenters from each brand. So monkeys get a choice of Clover brand versus the Moon brand. They make their choice, it's about equal, but then we make one of the goods go on sale. And so now the Moon brand has gone on sale. The monkeys get 3 times as much stuff there. And the question is, do the monkeys, as they should rationally, shift their purchasing more to the Moon? Do they sort of shift their budget set to buy more of the Moon stuff? And so here's what we find if we're plotting how often the monkeys pick the cheap guy and the cheap good versus the expensive good. Here's what happens in the control case where both of the prices are equal. I'm plotting how often they pick the cheap good. Basically what we find is they pick evenly. However, as soon as you make the cheap good go on sale, pretty much all the monkeys shop at the cheap experimenter really robustly. They seem to get price in the way we're teaching it to them. Question is, are we affecting their preferences for these different brands? And the way we asked that was to give the monkeys a slightly different shift in the way we presented them with the food. Now the monkeys meet these different traders, and they're paying the traders for the food. They meet this new Horseshoe brand, which is pretty expensive. They only get a tiny piece of cereal, versus the Moon brand, they get 3. They trade with each of these guys in their market separately. And then we just allow the monkeys to eat from these different brands themselves. So they come in, they don't have their typical wallet, but they just get to sample whichever foods they want. And the idea, if you imagine, is if you know the price of different wines, you might want to try a $500 wine, but given your personal finances, you might not be able to drink it every day. However, if you come to the Yale reception at the inauguration and at Peter's table is that $500 wine versus a $5 wine, and you don't have to pay, which one are you going to go for? And so this is what we were offering the monkeys. We're giving them a choice for free between the good that was cheap versus the good that was expensive. And the question is, do they, like us, go for the expensive one? And so I'll plot in yellow how often the monkeys pick cheap, and in brown how often they pick expensive. And this was a pretty robust finding where the monkeys were perfectly at chance. They just didn't care. They didn't, in this case, go for the expensive one, even though they just showed us that they knew something about what it meant for this good to be expensive. We've now done this a couple different ways using these kind of cheap and expensive brands. We've presented the monkeys with cheap and expensive novel foods, so the foods were new to them. And we've even tried out cheap and expensive familiar foods in case something about the novelty was messing with them. In all of these cases, what we found is just no effect. Even though humans robustly seem to pick up on a price as an indicator of value, we're not seeing this in the case of the monkeys. And this was the first spot whether we were finding a difference in these irrational biases in humans and monkeys, and the first case where we were finding that the monkeys were in fact a lot smarter than humans seem to be. And so the question is, why are we seeing the difference here? Why is it that the monkeys show loss aversion and reference dependence, but they're not tripped up by price in the same way that humans are, even though we've shown that they understand price as defined by economics or as defined by economists? Well, one idea we thought is that the market we've set up for the monkeys differs, of course, in a lot of ways from the markets that we see in humans. But one way in particular is that their goods and services, the prices of those things, are determined by the experimenters, determined by our whims of which particular question we're studying at any one time. It's not like a real human market where prices are determined in theory by supply and demand. So maybe one of the reasons they're not showing the effect is that they seem to not be present in markets where price is an honest indicator. That's one possibility. But we worried that the human price was telling us something different. That it's not that we're in markets where we learn something about the objective price of these real goods, the real price as based on supply and demand. Maybe what our real markets give us is that price tells us something about how much other people in our market want to buy it. Maybe it gives us a cue about what other people are thinking and what other people know and what other people desire. And you can see this a little bit if you think about the kinds of luxury goods we see in our society today. This is just a picture of the Apple store in New York the day before the iPhone 5 was going to be coming out. This is the day before, so 24 hours before, all these able-bodied youths are sitting outside the iPhone store waiting to get this new luxury good. You know, why is the iPhone 5 really good? I'm not really sure, but all these people seem to think the iPhone 5 is really good. Maybe it's really good. And the idea is that this might be what the price information is doing in the context of human cognition. Maybe pricing information is telling us something about what the other people know and what the other people want. And this might be one of the reasons we pay attention to it more than other primates. This is apparently the first guy to come out. This isn't the iPhone 5, this is the first iPhone. When people were waiting in line for many more than 24 hours, he came out and he was cheered for. Obviously this is a good that everybody wants. I don't even know what the iPhone is, but I should like it because everybody else likes it. And so this led us to question what else we know in the literature about primates, about the extent to which other animals pick up on what other individuals want and what other individuals like. And do they seem to do that in some cases more irrationally than humans do? Well, there's an interesting literature on this, looking not necessarily at preferences, but about understanding of different things, about cases of pedagogy and which teachers you listen to and which teachers you don't. This work was originally done by Vicki Horner and her colleagues, and it tests and compares chimpanzees and human children on a different puzzle box solving task. And here's how the puzzle box task goes. Kids and chimpanzees are presented with this weird box that has some food in it, and their task is to figure out how to open it. And it's pretty weird and complicated looking. You wouldn't normally be able to figure out how to open it, but the good news is that you have a human demonstrator. So this is what the box looks like. It's got a couple of affordances like this door and this thing on the top. You don't know what to do, but you get to watch somebody solve it. And so here's Vicki solving it for the chimpanzees. This is with chimpanzees who live in a sanctuary in Gamba Island. You can see she's showing the chimpanzees how to open it. I guess you have to take those little rods out at the top using this tool. You see the chimpanzee watching it. I guess you have to stick the tool inside, and then only then you can open it and then get the food out. So chimpanzees see that, and the question is, do they learn from what they saw the human do? And the answer, as you'll see, is that yes, they do. When they don't know how to solve something, they're perfectly happy using what somebody else knows to figure this out. And so they do the thing that Vicki did, opening the thing on the top with the tool, and then they use the tool to open the door. And so that's what happens in chimpanzees. And the neat thing is that the very same thing seems to happen in human children. If they watch a human adult solve this puzzle box, they're very capable of then solving the puzzle box themselves. That's Derek Lyons, who is a grad student here at Yale, who did some of this work as well. So kids totally figure this out and watch what somebody else knows. But none of this is irrational, of course, because they don't know how the box works. It's a perfectly good thing to do, to pay attention to what somebody else knows and then follow that and do it yourself. The question, though, is, what if it wasn't the obvious way to solve the box? Like here, you don't know how the box works, so it seems totally reasonable to take this thing out and use a stick to try to open it and do this whole thing before you open the door. But what if the box was transparent? And what if you could see, just because you're pretty smart causally, that there was a false top at the top of the box, and that there's nothing in the false top? So this whole part about taking the tool out and then kind of sticking the tool into the box like this is pretty stupid because it's not doing anything, it's just going into air. But you would probably be able to figure that out on your own, but what if you saw a well-intentioned demonstrator who was doing it the wrong way? What if you saw somebody do the bad part would you copy them? And would chimpanzees and children do this as well? And this is what Vicky Horner asked.
The second box that I show the chimpanzees is this one, and it's identical to the opaque box, except that it's made out of material which is see-through.
Only now is it obvious that the tapping and poking don't achieve a thing. The box has a false ceiling.
Okay, so you're a chimpanzee, you've just watched Vicky do this. You're physically capable of realizing about the false top. The question is, do you follow Vicky, or do you just sort it out on your own? Well, here's what chimpanzees do.
The chimps cut to the chase. They skip the needless steps. For the apes, it is all about the treat.
Okay, so pretty rational chimpanzees, they can figure out on their own how to solve it. They don't copy you at all. Question though, you're all already laughing, what about human children? Well, your laughter indicates you might have more insight into human children than you think, because here's what children do.
We found something quite surprising. The children were predisposed to copy, even when it meant that they were doing something that was really rather silly. So this seems a little like the chimps are outsmarting the kids in this particular study.
There he is. You got him out.
And so the claim here is that maybe what's going on in the case of some of these pricing effects and other effects is that we are very prone to follow what other social agents are telling us, even when those other social agents are doing something that's really rather silly or really particularly stupid. And now this was the earliest version of these findings by Vicky Horner and Andy White and colleagues. And these have now been replicated in a couple, I think, really important ways. One is the question to look at, is this just American kids who are trained, by tiger moms to follow what moms do and so on? Is this true in general of different populations, particularly ones where you don't have lots of complex artifacts around? And to test that, researchers went and tried the same sort of tests with the Kung in Africa, a modern-day hunter-gatherer population. And what you find is that children of the same age in these hunter-gatherer populations show this same imitation effect. In other words, they over-imitate what they see people do, even when they would have known how to do it themselves before. So it's not just something weird about American kids following what moms tell them, or kids who are prone to dealing with all these complex artifacts. Seems to be true, at least across the societies that have been tested so far. Another thing that Derek Lyons and Frank Kyle in this department here at Yale worried about was maybe this was just a case that the child thinks he's supposed to be following what the experimenter says. Of course, the experimenter is standing there, he's just shown him how to do it. Maybe it's not that it's really messing with what the kid understands about the object, maybe it's just the kid thinks he's supposed to do this. And so Derek designed a long and really clever series of studies to try to convince the child when he's being tested that, in fact, the experimenter is not watching you at all, the experiment's completely over, and it's a terrible emergency, and you must open the box as quickly as humanly possible. And so here's how Derek did it. I'll show you another short video of this. Here's Derek just demonstrating this other weird object. So that's the thing you need to do to open the box. And here's an irrelevant thing that's just a stick that's stuck into the middle of this thing touching nothing. Derek takes that out and then opens it and finds the good. So this is Derek, he teaches this thing, and then the experiment goes on. The child is presented with a bunch of other things that are supposed to be the real experiment, and Derek says, oh, you did great, experiments over, and now you're getting your prize. And so here's this happening.
The second kind of prize are these.
He's saying you did such a good job.
I'm just going to leave this one for the next kid.
Okay, perfect.
And so Dina comes in and says, this is for the next kid.
What these do is you put them
And so it's not even for her anymore. The next kid's gonna come in.
So listen, if you can just wait here 1 second, I just have to write down your answers because you did such a good job. I want to be sure I remember, okay? So I'll be right back.
So Derek says, I'm gonna write down your answers. He goes to leave and then he says, uh-oh, and here's the emergency.
Oh, wait a minute, listen, you know what? So there's another kid coming in, so I'm kind of in a hurry, but I got to write down your stuff. But last time when Dina brought these toys back in, she forgot to put the turtles back in the toys. So when the kid came to play, there were no turtles, and it like really spoiled the game. So while I'm in the other room writing down your answers, could you check and make sure there's turtles in here for me? Could you check both objects? Okay, cool.
So incompetent research assistant, there might not be turtles. The other kid's here. Can you open it as quickly as possible? And you see she's kind of trying to do this quickly. She's even doing this sort of tapping that Derek does to get the child's attention. yanks out the thing, and does the opening. So she even follows Derek when it's an emergency, no one's there to watch her, she has to do it really fast.
There's turtles!
So you see, she's taking this sort of very seriously. But basically what Derek's found is that in fact, it does seem like watching an intentional experimenter changes the way the child thinks about this particular game. Derek quizzes the child later to ask, how does the box causally work? And all the kids that saw him do the irrelevant action come up with a causal story, a physical story about why you need to take these objects out. They develop these rich ideas about the physical world just based on what intentional humans do, even when a child of that age could have told you that the box didn't work like that a few minutes earlier. Derek claims that it causally overrides the physical knowledge that children have that we get from watching other social agents. And I think this is one of the powerful mechanisms we have, perhaps uniquely as a human mind. We get to learn from all the smart things that other people do. But it might be that our minds aren't fit with a great filter for figuring out which of those things are smart and which of those things are dumb. It's a powerful mechanism if we're surrounded by people who are doing really nice things, but it's a bad thing to do if you're surrounded by people who are doing silly things. And so with that, I'm going to sort of jump to some conclusions. Really, what does this all mean? We'll go back to our very Yale-centric tree of the primate order. I think of what I've told you is that at least some of the kinds of irrational things we see humans doing on a regular basis in real markets with their stocks and on the golf course, we seem to see hints of across the primate tree. Particularly this guy right here, the brown capuchin monkey, we see that these guys also make these kinds of same errors, suggesting that perhaps some of the strategies we see humans using might be evolutionarily old. They might have emerged back at our common ancestor between President Salivey and the capuchin monkey way back here. And this would put us at about 35 million years ago. These might be strategies that seem irrational in current markets, but they might be evolutionarily really, really old. At the same time, we're finding that certain kinds of irrational things people do, we seem to do alone. So they're here on the sort of President Salivey branch, and they might not be there on similar branches in other species. This suggests that some of these kinds of strategies, like conforming and copying an experimenter who's doing something dumb, might be evolutionarily new. But it raises the question of what some of these strategies might be for in a good sense. What are they giving us to conform and pay attention and obey? Some interesting questions there. But rather than focus on that, I wanted to end really quickly today with the kinds of tips I think we're getting from monkeys. You know, what can we actually learn about our own decisions based on what I've told you? Well, I think a couple of important things, particularly from the first part of the talk, where we've seen such rich similarities. The first thing I think the monkeys teach us is that we need to take these reference points really seriously. And the reason is that they seem to be evolutionarily really old. We seem to pay attention to them for a long time. What other human strategies are evolutionarily old? Well, they tend to be things that are built in pretty severely. So imagine at the reception you see objects that look like this. You might be watching your weight or your cholesterol. You might rationally think you need to avoid those things, but I bet there's part of you that reacts to them in a very old evolutionary way that says, rich sugar, rich calories, I want to seek that thing out. The claim is that reference points might work in exactly the same way. It's also evolutionarily old, and it might also be just as hard to override. So if you happen, hopefully none of your portfolios look like this, but if you happen to see a portfolio that kind of went down and down and down, the claim is that it's going to be really tricky to respond to that, rationally speaking. It might work a lot like the cupcake, where you're going to have automatic responses to these that might be tricky to overcome. And I think that means we need to use reference points wisely in our own lives and pay attention to when they're there. Because it's true that other people are using these reference points against us. How many times have you seen an advertisement that's giving you information not about the current price, but about something that's completely irrelevant, like what the object used to be worth before? The claim is that you can't help seeing that except like seeing it like a cupcake. You're like, wow, this thing has to be a great value. It's really cheap now, right? You have to pay attention when people are using these reference points against you. The claim is that it's going to be hard for you to override your automatic reaction to what they look like. So that's sort of point number one. I think point number two is that we should think about the fact that reference points are there. I think reference points give rise to one of the funniest things about human cognition, which is that we don't have great predictions about what's going to make us happy in the future. We're good at predicting what's going to make us happy in the moment, but those kinds of choices we make don't have the long-term happiness impact we think. And part of the reason is due to reference points. When I first got my own iPhone, I thought the iPhone was going to change my life. Every day that I was as happy as that guy who walked out of the iPhone, that moment of happiness then, I thought when I woke up on a Thursday many years later, I would have that same happiness. But of course, that's not true. You know, a weekend's still pretty good. Now, a year later, it's just kind of the old iPhone and I want to get a new one, right? But this doesn't necessarily enter your calculations when you're thinking about buying new gadgets. You think, oh, a new iPad, that would make me so happy. You know, oh, a new, you know, whatever the next thing is, right? Well, why doesn't it? Well, it doesn't in part because of reference point settings. That when I was first buying the iPhone, I was a person without one, so getting it was this big gain. But the next day, I'm at a new status quo. I'm just an iPhone owner. It's just a regular thing in my life. And stuff that we buy, particularly things, tends to have this trait. It just becomes a new reference point, and we tend to not take that into account. And this sort of falls under the line of what psychologists have often referred to as this concept of the hedonic treadmill. This tendency to sort of set new reference points means that we often go back to a set level of happiness even when we get these good gains and these good losses in our lives. Because we return to the set point, these things that change don't have that much of an impact, or at least as much of an impact as we'd like to think. And a psychologist at Harvard, Dan Gilbert, has talked a lot about this in his work on affective forecasting. He had what I think is this fantastic quote in his book, Stumbling on Happiness, that wonderful things are especially wonderful the first time they happen, but their wonderfulness kind of wanes with repetition. You know, the first time your partner says, I love you, or the first time your child says, Mommy, this is like the best moment ever. But, you know, time 2046, you know, its wonderfulness has waned. This is the problem with us being a reference point setting species, is that the stuff that we love now, we're just going to get used to. It's just going to be a status quo. And so the question remains, how do we get off the treadmill? Well, the good news is that we're seeing lots of ways that we can split our reference points up, break up the status quo so we don't do this. One is just to increase the kinds of variety in your life. By doing the same thing over and over again, this fifth cone of chocolate ice cream is going to seem exactly like the first one. It's just going to be your reference point, no extra happiness bang for your buck. The way to break it up, of course, is to include variety. You know, if you switched it up a bit, by the time you get to the fifth ice cream cone, it would now seem like something new and exciting. You'd get extra chocolateness bang for your buck by having switched it up. This is what variety does, and it's also what timing different events does pretty well. If you were to have, you kind of know implicitly the two ice cream cones within 14 seconds of each other, you're going to get this diminishing returns, in part because you set this reference point. You're just an ice cream cone eater right now. But, you know, if you wait a little bit of a while from time one of awesome thing to time two, you can get off the hedonic treadmill briefly. And I think, again, this is something the human species implicitly knows. If you take some of the best events we experience in our lives, things like weddings or Yale reunions or presidential inaugurations, for example, we tend to do the best things very, very infrequently. And if you think about it, it makes sense. You know, this presidential inauguration would be a fantastic weekend, but if we had to come out and do this every single Friday, you know, it would wane in comparison with how awesome it was. And so we can use timing to pop off the treadmill, but the third thing we can use to pop off the treadmill is to remember that when we're spending to increase happiness, we should avoid spending on things. And I'm underlining buying the right things here, because things tend to have this quality that they don't really work well for a reference point setting species. All the kinds of new gadgets you might want to buy at the moment of purchase will be a gain for you, but as soon as you own them, you'll just be an owner. You'll get way less happiness bang for your buck with them. And it turns out that psychologists have learned that this seems to be true. If you're looking at the happiness boost you get for things over time, things wane, but spending your money on things that won't last, things like experiences, things like going on a vacation, going to a concert, or going to the movies, those things don't have time to become your new reference point. It would be nice if the vacation could just become the new reference point. You were just, you know, on the cruise like Lori, but that doesn't happen unless you're very, very wealthy. And so the beauty of spending your money on experiences, you don't have to worry about the reference point problem. You can avoid this 35 million year old glitch in our happiness technology and just enjoy the things you give. The same sort of thing can be said by spending your money on things, but not things that you yourself will get, things that other people will get. And this mirrors work by people like Mike Norton at Harvard and Liz Dunn at UBC, who are finding that buying things for other people and donating in general seems to have more happiness bang for our buck than spending the money on ourselves. And this is just a little AYA. The AYA folks are like putting their thumbs up. take that away. So the whole point of this has been to say that one way to deal with the fact that we have these irrationalities stuck around for 35 million years is to try to use our own biases to our advantage. And if you need other hints for how to do this, I highly recommend this recent book by Thaler and Sunstein on nudges. How can you actually improve your decisions, not by overriding your biases, but kind of using them to your advantage. And so with that, I will kind of end quickly. I want to sort of convince you, or I hope I've convinced you, that studying the evolution of cognition is important, and also studying the duncier parts of our cognition is important, and that looking across the evolutionary history of these things is very critical. And so with that, I will give you my thank you slide. This is my thank you slide because I'm this monkey here who's not doing anything, who's just kind of relaxing. These are all my students and funders who did all the hard work. Here's all the folks you've heard about before and the folks that paid for it. And I kind of wanted to end with a bit of a shout out to my colleague, Peter Salve. This is Peter when I met him, when he was chair of the department, when I got hired by the psychology department here. And Peter was fantastically useful in bringing a psychologist here and convincing the university that it would be worth giving this really young random grad student psychologist a very, very expensive primate facility on campus. And he did a fantastic thing to advance the science by helping me do that. And he's been such a wonderful, wonderful colleague. I can't imagine what fantastic things he'll do for the university. And just to highlight the kinds of awesome things Peter did as provost, I'm excited to announce, and I'm happy to announce here at Peter's celebration, that we will soon be opening Yale's first Canine Cognition Center. This will be a new center where we're looking at the evolution of the mind, not by studying other primates, but by studying man's best friend. We are already doing some work at different doggy daycare centers in the New Haven area. This is my postdoc, Ellen Furlong, showing some of the studies we do. But I'm excited to report that we will be opening a cognition center for dogs at Yale University. If any of you in the room have companion animals, little furry friends who like science, we would love to recruit them, so please come see me afterwards. We're hoping, we just came back to see the new flooring on the facility. It's going to be very, very cute for your canine friends. And we're going to be hoping to open sometime in November. And so I hope you will share not just in the fun of science, but you'll have your pets share in the fun of science too. And with that, I will really, really end. Thank you for your time.